They call me the Father of Faith. It is the title history remembers, the one the storytellers praise around the fire, weaving narratives of simple, blind conviction. They see the vast tents spread out across the plain, the countless flocks, the immense wealth and the respect in the eyes of my thousands of servants, assuming a man in my position must be immune to the common frailties of the heart. They see the fulfilled life, the eventual destiny, the patriarch who birthed a nation, and they mistakenly conclude that the decades of waiting were simply a peaceful meditation on God's certainty. But here, in the quiet intimacy of my tent, away from the watchful eyes of my household, I must confess the truth of the man behind the title. That profound designation, Father of Faith, has often felt like the heaviest, most elaborate, and most suffocating mask I have ever been forced to wear. If you, listening to this confession, are currently struggling with a purpose that feels too heavy, or a divine or personal promise that seems perpetually delayed, I urge you, before you continue, share this reflection with one person who is currently searching for their purpose. Sometimes the most liberating insight is knowing that the struggle itself, the doubt, the fear, the intense anxiety, is not a failure of faith, but an intrinsic, painful part of the sacred journey toward meaning and conviction. The cold, hard truth, the one I buried deep beneath layers of patriarchal dignity and leadership, is that I spent not just years, but decades of my maturity as a profoundly, agonizingly anxious man. That anxiety was not merely a passing worry. It was the persistent, relentless climate of my soul, a constant low-frequency hum of dread beneath the surface of my public composure. Every morning, I would rise before the sun even cleared the eastern hills, look out at the seemingly endless horizon, and the first question that struck me, before prayer or breakfast, was always the same. Is this still real? My entire existence, my entire identity, had been uprooted and rebuilt upon a single, solitary voice that spoke from the void, promising me an impossible, astronomical legacy of descendants, a nation for the ages, when all I possessed was a childless tent and 2 aging bodies. I had abandoned everything familiar, my wealthy home, my family, the certainty of my comfortable past, for an unprecedented, colossal commitment that seemed to mock the natural laws of biology and time. How I often ask myself now, reflecting on those years of agonizing stagnation, does one live and lead day after day, year after year, under the crushing weight of such a monumental self-imposed expectation? It is the peculiar, silent burden of the mature man and woman carrying the immense, often paralyzing expectations set by a younger, more confident self who made irreversible, life-altering decisions. I was that young, brave, fiery man who decisively stepped out of willing to risk it all. But that initial youthful fire eventually subsided, giving way to a cold, persistent, and terrifying dread, the anxiety of sustaining the conviction. The world saw a dynamic, God-chosen leader. I, in the deepest hours of the night, saw a frightened old man running inexorably out of sand in his hourglass. I walked among my thousands of people, issuing orders, mediating disputes, the very picture of competence and spiritual composure, all while a frantic internal clock relentlessly hammered against my ribs, shouting, "Hurry, you are failing. Time is winning this war against the promise." I was, for a vast, empty stretch of my middle years, in a perpetual state of exhausting performance, forced to carefully curate my public face to flawlessly match the grand narrative God had assigned me. This performance was not entirely selfish. I had to maintain the illusion of certainty for the sake of my household, for the sake of Sarah, and most critically, for the sake of the promise itself, ensuring no one, least of all myself, allowed the whole fragile structure to collapse. But the catastrophic price of maintaining that stoic mask was the relentless erosion of my own internal peace. My mind, which should have been a sanctuary of faith, became a relentless, chaotic desert, the hot, constant wind of doubt, howling questions of self-doubt into every crevice of my consciousness. Did I fatally mishear that divine voice? Am I simply delusional, clinging to the madness of a singular, hallucinated conversation? What if my entire promised legacy is not the glory of a nation, but a great, pathetic joke played on a lonely, foolish old man? The exhaustion of maintaining the facade of unwavering faith, I tell you now, was far more profoundly draining than the physical demands of leading a massive migratory people across vast wildernesses. You see, my most profound and life-altering anxiety was not about navigating simple, tangible challenges. It was not about surviving a sudden famine or about plotting strategy to defeat a rival king. Those were challenges I could touch, fight, and win with my own hands and intellect. My true incapacitating torment was the existential anxiety of the long wait, the sheer, relentless pressure to sustain a staggering conviction that lacked any physical, tangible evidence, decade after silent decade. It is the deep-seated, paralyzing fear that the single most important choice of your entire life, the crucial, defining pivot you made in your youth or early maturity, was, in fact, your greatest, most foolish delusion. And when you are Abro, a patriarcha and a spiritual leader of thousands, whose identity is inextricably linked to divine assurance, who can you possibly confess that terrifying, paralyzing doubt to without causing the total spiritual collapse of your entire community? I was fundamentally a man of action, a decisive Mesopotamian leader, yet I found myself forced into a frustrating, life-altering paradigm of inaction, of merely waiting, a condition antithetical to my very nature. I would stare fixedly at the black, endless night sky, that famous celestial canvas where he had vividly promised my descendants would gloriously outnumber the stars, and the sheer impossible scale of that image would no longer inspire any semblance of hope. Instead, it began to induce a chilling physical panic attack. The stars were simply too numerous, the years required for fulfillment were stretching too long, and the bodies of Sarah and myself were visibly, undeniably too old. My purpose, my entire life's work and identity, was irrevocably shackled to a future that felt increasingly like a distant, cruel mirage. A destination that required a stamina and longevity I feared I simply did not possess. That, my friends, is the true debilitating crisis of the second act of life. Recognizing the decay and limitations of your own human power while the scope of your unfinished, divine or personal mission only grows larger, mocking your mortality. The great epics and the prophets' histories honor the hero who courageously overcomes a great, visible, external obstacle. I submit to you, after 100 years of existence, that the man who successfully overcomes the relentless internal enemy, his own paralyzing fear, his crushing anxiety, and the tyrannical pressure of the clock, is the truly greater hero. I realized late in life that I was not yet ready to truly be called the father of faith. I was merely a desperate, deeply human man, fighting desperately to be the father of anything that was real, tangible, and immediate. I desperately craved the human-scale achievement, the comfort of the quick result, but I was instead bound to the terrifying glacial scale of the ages and the divine timetable. My ultimate obstacle was far more vast and far more invisible than any earthly enemy. It was the crippling terror of sustained uncertainty. And that profound, soul-consuming terror, my friends, is ultimately what drove me toward the single greatest, most painful, and most regrettable mistake of my long, complicated life. That profound terror of sustained uncertainty, that silent, gnawing fear that I was simply deluded, that I would die an ancient, childless fool, led directly to my single most regrettable, most human failure. The entire painful story of Agar and Ismail. Listen closely, because this wasn't merely a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness born from lust. No, it was a catastrophic collapse of control, a desperate, calculated act driven by the sheer, paralyzing exhaustion of waiting. Sarah and we were so consumed by the visible decay of our bodies, by the mockery of time, that we convinced ourselves the divine plan had a loophole, a contingency that we, the shrewd mortals, had to activate. The promise was too magnificent, too immense to be dependent solely on the impossible fertility of two elderly people. It was an act of audacious, unforgivable human impatience, dressed up in the false piety of helping God fulfill his own word. We were no longer seeking the divine timescale. We were desperately trying to compress a geological era into the remaining few years of our mortal lives. The moment Sarah suggested taking her servant Agar to bear a son on her behalf, I did not see the profound ethical and spiritual breach we were committing. I saw only the blinding, irresistible glimmer of a quick fix to my overwhelming anxiety. I saw an escape hatch from the relentless pressure of barrenness, a tangible physical answer to the cosmic question mark hanging over my head. My desperate need for proof, for a warm, breathing body that could be called air, utterly eclipsed my faith in the invisible, slow-moving hand of Providence. That decision, made out of a sheer human desire for palpable results, was an act of profound self-betrayal, the ultimate demonstration that the father of faith lacked the inner fortitude to simply stand still and trust the silence. That boy, Ismael, was not born of love or destiny. He was born of my chronic, debilitating anxiety of performance, a physical manifestation of my desperate need to finally control the narrative of my own life. And the cost of that impatience, the staggering debt incurred by that momentary lapse into human expediency, became a bitter, unrelenting torment that scarred my soul deeper than any famine or war. Ismael was proof, yes, but he was proof of my failure to wait. He was the tangible, living echo of my doubt, a beautiful, innocent child whose very existence was a constant, painful reminder of my inability to trust the process. When the true promise, the long-awaited miracle finally manifested in Isaac, the tension became unbearable, a deep, poisonous chasm tearing my household apart. The guilt I felt for loving Ismael, yet knowing he was the physical symbol of my lack of faith, was crushing. It is a guilt that resonates with the mature heart, the profound, sharp regret over past choices made in panic or haste, those impulsive decisions that secured a fleeting, immediate comfort but resulted in a lingering, devastating consequence for those we love the most. The profound, agonizing choice to send Agar and Ismael away, a decree executed to secure the purity of the divine lineage, felt like tearing my own flesh. Do not be misled by the histories that sanitize the moment. It was not a simple, necessary decree. It was the painful harvest of my spiritual impatience. Standing there, watching them disappear into the vast, indifferent wilderness, that was the moment I truly understood the magnitude of the debt I had incurred. I had used human means to solve a divine problem, and now I had to pay the ultimate price. The brutal severance of a father-son bond, and the shattering realization that my desire to accelerate the promise had only resulted in an immense, preventable suffering. That guilt, the vivid, enduring memory of Ismael's tearful face and Agar's broken body walking away from the life I owed them. This is the heavy inheritance I carry, far heavier than any blessing or wealth. I confessed to God, yes, but the confession did not instantly erase the memory of the mistake or the pain inflicted. True repentance, I learned, is not just apologizing for the error, but living with the continuous, systemic consequences of the error, day after day, year after year. Every time I looked at Isaac, the son of the promise, I saw the ghost of Ismael, the son of my panic. This complex, enduring emotional burden forced me to redefine what it meant to be a man of faith in my later years. It taught me that genuine faith is not the absence of failure, but the brutal, humbling acceptance of the consequences and the slow, arduous and sometimes painful work of rebuilding character despite the visible haunting scars of past mistakes. This profound realization, born from immense personal pain, is the difficult wisdom that only true maturity can impart. My failure with Agar and Ismael became my greatest, most effective teacher. It was the undeniable proof that my human striving, my attempts to force the timeline, always led to sorrow, chaos, and ultimately a more profound sense of emptiness. I was forced to confront the destructive nature of my anxiety, seeing its consequences walking away across the desert sand. I learned that the impatience of the successful man is often just a disguised form of deep insecurity, a profound lack of trust in the flow of life itself. The memory of their exile broke the iron grip of my need for control, forcing me to surrender, not just to God's will, but to God's timing. It was a brutal lesson in humility, teaching me that the vast difference between an aging man and a true patriarch is the ability to withstand the temptation of the immediate comfort for the sake of the distant, uncertain, but necessary divine plan. This is the true cost of my title, the debt I want you to understand. I paid for my impatience with a piece of my own soul. I paid for my anxiety with a family ripped apart. If you are struggling right now with the burden of past choices, with the shame of trying to force a breakthrough, I tell you, there is redemption, but it begins with the stark, unvarnished confession of the mistake. My life, rich and long as it is not a testament to perfect faith, but to perfected resilience, a slow, painful process achieved despite my monumental failures, and in many ways because of them. Stay with me, because the deepest part of my story, the moment I finally found freedom from the tyranny of the clock and the secret to sustaining purpose in the silence, I have not shared yet. The brutal severance from Ismael, the son of my panic, was not the end of the debt. It was merely the entrance to my true dark night of the soul. After that devastating expulsion, the universe itself seemed to fall silent. I had acted. I had failed, and then I had corrected, but the deep, resonant voice that had initially called me out of disappeared. I was left alone, in the vast, crushing silence of the Negev, with only the echo of my own frantic, anxious thoughts for company. It was a silence far more terrifying than any natural disaster because it stripped me of my very identity. For decades, I had defined myself by one singular characteristic: the man who hears God. Now the communication was cut, and I was just an aging, childless man. Despite having a son, Isaac, the weight of the earlier era overshadowed the present blessing, wandering under a merciless sun, carrying a burden of wealth and responsibility that felt utterly meaningless without divine direction. My deepest fear, the one I confessed in the beginning, seemed confirmed. I was nothing more than a delusional old fool, clinging to a singular, fantastical memory. And now, even the memory was starting to fade into doubt. That profound isolation and the terrifying loss of conviction pushed me into a state I can only describe as spiritual and mental despair. It was not just sadness, it was a fundamental emptiness, a vacuum where my life's purpose had once roared. The very foundations of my existence, the certainty of the covenant, the meaning of my journey, the love for my distant son, seemed to crumble simultaneously. I began to experience days, sometimes weeks, where the mere act of rising from my bed felt like hauling the entire weight of the world. My vitality, the inner fire that had propelled me across continents, was extinguished, replaced by a cold, leaden indifference. I looked at my tents, my thousands of servants, my immense power, and saw only a vast, elaborate stage set for a play that had been abruptly cancelled. I was successful, yes, but success had become my prison. It offered no comfort, no solace, and no answers to the essential question: if my life's mission is a lie, who am I really? In that dark, agonizing period, I often wished for death. Not a dramatic, heroic death in battle, but a quiet, merciful cessation. A surrender to the dust from which I was taken, a final, weary acknowledgement of my failure to sustain the impossible faith. I would walk out to the edges of the camp, far from Sarah's worried gaze and the clamor of the herds, and simply stare into the blackness, inviting the oblivion I felt I deserved. My spirit was utterly consumed by the thought that I had wasted my entire maturity on a fool's errand, leading thousands of innocent people down a path of uncertainty and eventual disillusionment. This was the bottom. Not the physical loss of wealth or security, but the devastating internal loss of all meaning. It is the ultimate crisis of identity in maturity, when the role you have played for decades, the title you earned, suddenly collapses, leaving you naked, vulnerable, and facing the sheer terrifying absurdity of existence without a defined purpose. I began to question everything I had taught my household, every word of assurance I had ever offered my people. I felt like a fraud, a deeply flawed human trying to teach virtue he no longer possessed. My anxiety metastasized into chronic self-condemnation. Every good decision I had made seemed irrelevant when weighed against the irreversible pain of Agar and Ismael. My leadership became mechanical, robotic. I was going through the motions of the patriarch, but the soul was absent. I was living proof that external success is not a buffer against internal collapse. The silence from the heavens was the cruelest punishment, forcing me into a profound, terrifying confrontation with the man I had become. A highly successful, yet spiritually and emotionally bankrupt wanderer, terrified of the future and drowning in the shame of the past. The despair reached its zenith one night when I decided to test the silence, to break the unbearable quiet with my own human voice. I screamed into the star-laden sky, that same sky that had once been my greatest source of inspiration, demanding an answer, a sign, a confirmation of sanity. I demanded to know why he would choose a man so riddled with doubt, so easily swayed by panic, a man whose best intentions led to heartbreak. I cursed my own age, my own frailty, and the endless cruel passage of time. I did not receive a thunderous reply. I did not receive a vision. There was only the sound of my own voice, distorted by the desert air, echoing back my weakness. And in that terrifying, desolate echo, I realized I had reached the end of my human striving. I had exhausted every resource, every personal strategy, every ounce of my will to force a divine outcome. I had nothing left to give, nothing left to try, nothing left to prove. This total, agonizing exhaustion, the profound weariness of the spirit that accompanies the recognition of one's own impotence, became the unexpected, painful catalyst for change. When the pressure to do finally yields to the necessity to be, the ground shifts. My identity, which had been so rigidly defined by my mission, the man who will build the nation, was forced to shatter. And in that moment of absolute breakage, lying humbled in the dust of my own spiritual failure, I finally achieved a terrifying, fragile kind of clarity. The anxiety had always been the fear of losing control. Now, having lost everything that mattered, my inner peace, my certainty, a son, I had nothing left to fear losing. The fear was gone, replaced by a devastating yet strangely liberating emptiness. It was in that state of total surrender, that quiet, dusty surrender to the fact that I was powerless over the timing and the execution of the promise, that the heavy, suffocating silence of the universe finally began to feel different. The silence was no longer an accusation of my failure. It began to feel impossibly like permission. Permission to rest, permission to stop striving, permission to be merely human, merely me, Abraham, the flawed man, instead of the infallible patriarch. The realization that I was utterly powerless became the first, tiny, fragile seed of my emotional and spiritual resurrection. The depth of the fall was necessary to teach me where the true source of strength And the secret to the long wait really lies. That terrifying, devastating silence, the one I mistook for abandonment in the deepest pit of my despair, was the very thing that eventually led me to the profound, quiet realization I now call the first glimmer. It didn't arrive with a dramatic flourish or a booming supernatural command. It came as a gentle, almost imperceptible shift in my perception, a quiet rereading of the original contract. When the pressure to do finally evaporated, when the anxiety that demanded quick results was exhausted, the true, subtle wisdom of the promise could finally be heard. I realized the voice had never demanded my success. It had only demanded my sustained presence. The fundamental error of my anxiety was believing that my purpose was the destination, the birth of Isaac, the establishment of the nation, when in fact my primary purpose, the true essence of the covenant, was the journey itself, the act of persistent, daily walking. The true miracle was not just the fulfillment, but the sheer improbable fact that an aging, flawed man managed to keep walking for 50 years based only on a whisper. I looked back at the years wasted in frantic self-condemnation and human manipulation, the shadow of Ismael, and suddenly understood that my persistent efforts to accelerate the promise were actually a form of deep disrespect for the divine timing and the sheer magnitude of the plan. The long wait was not a punitive delay designed to mock me. It was, in its essence, the necessary forge for my character. How could I possibly become the patriarch of a great, enduring people, a people who would face endless trials and dispersions, if I, their progenitor, could not even sustain faith and integrity through a period of mere domestic barrenness? The long, arid years were the essential curriculum, the masterclass in humility and resilience. The silence was not judgment. It was the sacred, profound space required for the deeper, more enduring lessons to finally sink into the bones of a deeply impatient man. This profound insight allowed me to redefine the nature of my faith and, critically, to begin the long, slow work of re-engineering my identity. I stopped identifying as Abraham, the failsafe for God's plan, and started to embrace the fragile, honest role of Abraham, the flawed student of time. This subtle but seismic shift liberated me from the tyranny of the visible result. The anxiety had thrived on the obsession with the finish line. The newfound clarity allowed me to redirect all my energy onto the act of walking. My daily purpose changed entirely. It was no longer about securing the future, which was beyond my power, but about honoring the present, caring for my animals with diligence, treating my servants with justice, and loving Sarah fully in the now, without the shadow of the looming unfulfilled promise darkening our intimacy. It was during this period of intentional, focused slowing down that I truly found the echo of the inner voice. It was not a loud proclamation of future glory, but a quiet, powerful affirmation of my worth, in spite of my failures. The voice, I realized, was not there to solve all my problems. It was there simply to affirm my sanction to continue. It whispered, "Do not stop leading, do not stop walking, do not stop being just." It never said, "I will deliver the sun tomorrow." This realization was the true key to managing my lifelong anxiety. The purpose of the call was not to eliminate doubt, but to empower the walk through the doubt. The strength I sought was not in a vision of the end, but in the mundane spiritual fortitude required to face the terrifying uncertainty of the next day with integrity. I finally understood that the covenant was about a relationship, not just an outcome. My job, my true purpose in my advanced years, was not to manipulate the timeline or produce the heir. My job was to manage my own heart through the wait. My primary responsibility became the internal work of cultivating resilience, emotional honesty, and radical patience. This was the true difficult work of the patriarch. It became clear that the purpose of my life was to become a living, breathing testament to the idea that doubt and conviction can coexist, provided that the conviction is rooted in the quality of the journey, not the speed of the arrival. My great-great-grandchildren would need a story of persistence, not of effortless victory. They needed to know their ancestor wrestled with the same despair they would one day face. This insight that the time I spent waiting was not empty, but was in fact the single most vital, formative period of my entire life, was the moment the burden of my title finally began to lift. The stars were still impossibly numerous, and my body was still aging, but the pressure was gone. The grand expectation no longer felt like a suffocating debt. It felt like a dignified, worthy task of stewardship. My task was to simply steward the promise through the turbulent waters of my own human frailty. This shift in perspective, this ability to distinguish between the divine will and the divine timetable, saved me from the abyss and allowed me for the first time in decades to truly savor the dignity of my age and the quiet, profound gift of the present moment. If this idea of radical surrender to the timetable resonates with the anxiety you carry, I urge you, do not let this realization simply pass you by. Hit the subscribe button and ring the bell, because the true practical work of building a renewed purpose and overcoming deep, chronic anxiety begins in the next section. We must move from insight to action, and I want to share the specific practices that finally anchored my heart against the winds of doubt. The first glimmer of acceptance, that moment of fragile relief I found in the dust, was not the cure. It was merely the prescription. True liberation from the tyranny of the clock required a disciplined, intentional effort, a complete re-engineering of my purpose from the inside out. I had to systematically dismantle the identity I had built upon frantic effort and immediate results, and replace it with a structure built on sustainable spiritual fortitude. The first and most crucial step in this arduous process was shifting my focus from the macro purpose, the impossible nation, the uncountable stars, to the micro purpose, the sacred, achievable duties of the present moment. I ceased obsessing over the finish line and began honoring the grass beneath my feet. This meant dedicating my full present attention to the mundane daily acts of stewardship, overseeing the health of my flocks, ensuring justice among my servants, and most profoundly, being truly and fully present with Sarah, acknowledging her silent anxiety instead of drowning her in my own. This redefinition demanded the radical practice of intentional daily grounding. My days could no longer be ruled by the overwhelming prospect of the future. They had to be anchored by the certainty of the here and now. I established strict routines, not out of compulsion, but as spiritual anchors against the powerful currents of doubt. When the anxiety inevitably flared, that familiar, frantic voice demanding, "What if it's all a lie?" I used physical, tangible tasks as my retort. I would deliberately spend hours with my hands in the dirt, building a small altar, digging a new well, or meticulously counting and organizing the existing herds. This engagement with the practical, observable reality served as a crucial reality check, confirming that while the promise was intangible, my life was real, demanding, and valuable right now. I learned that managing chronic, debilitating anxiety is often less about profound theological insight and more about the humble, consistent commitment to the concrete duties of the present hour. Furthermore, I realized I had to dismantle the deeply ingrained myth of the self-made patriarch. My constant striving had been fueled by the arrogant, subtle belief that the success of the promise ultimately depended on my cunning, my planning, and my ability to compensate for divine slowness. I had to consciously, daily, practice radical dependence. This involved a spiritual exercise of verbally surrendering the outcome back to the source, not just in formalized prayer, but in casual, constant recognition throughout the day. This flock is not sustained by my strength, but by grace. This journey is not navigated by my map, but by guidance. It was a continuous, humbling exercise in recognizing my own limitations, which paradoxically led to immense inner power. When I finally internalized that the mission's success was not my burden to carry alone, the suffocating pressure that had driven me to despair instantly lifted, freeing up all the energy I had been wasting on worry and control. My most difficult, yet most essential piece of practical work was the reconciliation with the past. The ghost of Ismail lingered, a constant source of profound guilt. I understood that true spiritual progress was impossible while I allowed that unresolved pain to continue corroding my present peace. The lesson was stark. I had to accept that the mistake, the profound failure with Agar, was an event, a regrettable one, yes. But it was not my final identity. I had to separate the sin from the identity of the sinner. My purpose became about showing redemption through enduring perseverance, not about achieving a sterile perfection that was never possible. I learned to look at my scars not as marks of shame, but as maps detailing the terrain of my growth, the necessary evidence that I was a survivor, a testament to the idea that profound failure can pave the road to authentic, mature resilience. This re-engineering of self allowed me to find profound, stable satisfaction in the process, rather than holding my happiness hostage to the delivery of the distant outcome. I found joy in the simple rhythmic migration, in the sound of my servant's laughter, in the growing quiet wisdom of Sarah. My purpose transitioned from achieving the promise to becoming the kind of man worthy of the promise, a man defined by patience, humility, and unwavering justice, regardless of my lack of an heir at that moment. This internal transformation, the shift from desperation to dignity, was the silent miracle that unfolded over the years, proving that the true value of life resides not in what is eventually given to you, but in the character you actively build while waiting for it. The years I spent maintaining the conviction were infinitely more valuable than the moment the conviction was finally validated. The practical wisdom I offer you now, you who carry the weight of decades and delayed dreams, is to cease the acceleration. You must stop hating the waiting room. The waiting room is not a mistake. It is the most critical workshop of your maturity. Reframe the waiting not as an enemy that steals your time, but as an ally that forges your soul. Your work is not to rush the destination which is beyond your control, but to refine the instrument, your mind, your heart, your patience that must carry you there. Anchor your spirit in the day's duties, surrender the anxiety of the outcome, and find your dignity in the honest, consistent effort of the present. This slow, quiet work of sustained obedience to the small tasks is the secret to transcending the crisis of identity in your later years. If this deep dive into the practical work of resilience has offered you a new anchor for your own journey through uncertainty, I have a simple request. Leave a comment below sharing one single, small daily discipline that helps you regain control when the anxiety of the future becomes overwhelming. Your shared wisdom will serve as a lighthouse for others who are still navigating their own desert of doubt. Now, I must move on to share the final, profound truth of my legacy. The slow, painstaking work of re-engineering my purpose, of anchoring my restless heart in the present moment, eventually yielded a fulfillment far richer and more sustaining than the mere birth of Isaac, the son of the promise. The ultimate gift of the long wait was the realization that my true, enduring mission in the second half of my life was not to achieve the promise which God had secured, but to become the living, embodied wisdom necessary to steward the promise. My identity transformed from that of a desperate, striving pioneer into that of a settled, resilient patriarch, a mentor and a living testament to the difficult truth that profound anxiety and deep conviction can, and often must, coexist. My purpose was no longer defined by the miraculous event of the future, but by the quiet, daily spiritual fortitude of the present. I became the evidence, the physical proof, that one can survive decades of intense uncertainty and emerge with one's soul not just intact, but deepened. This renewed purpose manifested as a profound responsibility to transmit the wisdom of the struggle. My legacy, I finally understood, would not be measured by the sheer number of my descendants I could count, but by the quality of the story I left behind, the honest, unvarnished account of my wrestling with doubt, my catastrophic failure with Agar, and my slow, humble climb out of despair. The generations to come, my physical descendants and those who claim my faith, would face their own deserts of doubt, their own crippling periods of waiting. They would need a patriarch who was not a myth of perfection, but a complex, deeply flawed, and profoundly redeemed man. My new mission became the conscious act of showing them that their own failures, their own anxieties, were not obstacles to their destiny, but the very crucible in which their true, enduring character would be forged. I found a deep, stable satisfaction in this transition, from the pressure of creation to the dignity of conservation. My work became less about conquering physical territories and more about mapping the internal, spiritual terrain. I devoted my later years to teaching my children and servants the profound difference between a fleeting achievement and an enduring legacy. An achievement is what the world sees. A legacy is the internal map you leave behind for those who follow. I realized that my value was not diminishing with age. It was multiplying. Every gray hair, every crease on my skin, every scar from a past mistake became a chapter in the essential instruction manual for resilience. My maturity was not a limitation. It was the ultimate resource, the deep well of experience that finally gave authentic weight and resonance to my words. The test of this renewed purpose, the moment that secured its permanence in my soul, came years later with the agonizing, unthinkable demand to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah. It was the ultimate cruel twist on the crisis of the wait, demanding not just patience, but the utter, absolute surrender of the fulfilled promise. But by then, I was no longer the anxious man who frantically tried to force a son through Agar. I was the patient, resilient man who had learned that true conviction is not about clinging to the gift, but about trusting the giver. The Moriah test was not about the tragedy of the sacrifice. It was about the proof of the internal transformation, the evidence that the long, hard work of managing my anxiety and re-engineering my identity had successfully prepared me for the ultimate demonstration of faith. I walked up that mountain not with the paralyzing fear of the past, but with a quiet, profound certainty, a certainty born not of mystical visions, but of hard-won experience. I knew, deep in my soul, that the promise had already become bigger than Isaac, bigger than my life, bigger than any single man. My identity was now anchored, not in my human ability to produce or protect, but in my spiritual ability to yield and trust. The greatest discovery of my maturity was that the true foundation of purpose is not effort, but ease. The profound, restful ease that comes from complete surrender of the timeline. The purpose had settled into my core, immutable and unshakable, no longer dependent on any external validation. This is the great, comforting truth I want to pass to you, who are navigating your second act. Your value is in your years. Your unique purpose now is to stop striving for the young man's goals and start embodying the old man's wisdom. Embrace your experience as your greatest currency. Your purpose is to be the honest map, to show those who come next that the crisis of doubt is not a terminal failure, but a necessary, painful transformation. Let your renewed mission be defined by the quiet, profound act of holding the line, managing your anxiety with grace, practicing justice with integrity, and transmitting the resilience you painfully earned. You are not running out of time. You are finally ripening into the mentor you were meant to be. If my journey from the anxious fugitive to the resilient patriarch has offered you a path out of your own crisis of identity, consider visiting the link in the description to explore the ancient texts and commentaries that fueled my spiritual re-engineering, the wisdom that can anchor your own modern quest for purpose. May your remaining years be defined not by the acceleration of time, but by the depth of your seasoned conviction. I have shared with you the unvarnished truth. I was not born the father of faith. I was painfully forged into him by the relentless pressure of the long wait and the crushing weight of my own anxiety. The ultimate revelation of my century-long journey is that the profound crisis of purpose you feel in your maturity, that sickening fear that time has run out, that your life's best work is behind you, is not a sign of failure, but an essential invitation. It is the universe forcing you to dismantle the false, frantic, control-driven self of your younger years and step fully into the spacious, dignified and wise identity that only decades of struggle can bestow. You are not running out of time. You are, if you choose to see it, finally ripening into the most valuable version of yourself, the one defined not by youthful potential, but by hard-won, tested, and enduring resilience. The anxiety will likely never entirely vanish, but its power over you will dissolve the moment you stop fighting the timeline and start embracing the difficult, profound beauty of the process. This final confidence I offer is simple, yet revolutionary for the anxious heart. The true battle for purpose is internal, and it is won daily in the quiet discipline of sustained conviction, not in grand, visible victories. Stop measuring your life against the frantic, impossible pace of the digital world or the aggressive ambition of your youth. Your value, your legacy, is now defined by your capacity for radical patience and the wisdom you carry in your bones. Every grey hair is a badge of honor, every scar a testament to battles survived. Your anxiety thrives on the illusion of control. Your peace will blossom from the radical surrender of the outcome. Your mission is no longer to build the kingdom, but to steward the journey with integrity, ensuring that the ground you walk today is honored, and that the person you are today is worthy of the destiny you were promised long ago. I urge you now to stop wasting your precious, seasoned energy on the impossible task of accelerating the divine. The profound error of my early life was believing that the speed of my fulfillment was dependent upon the intensity of my striving. It is not. The greatest strength you possess at this stage of life is the authority of experience. Use that authority not to dictate the future, but to bring absolute, focused peace to the present. Anchor yourself in your daily achievable duties, the maintenance of your relationships, the pursuit of justice in your small sphere, the continuous, humble cultivation of your inner spirit. When the fear of what if inevitably strikes, respond with the evidence of your present commitment. I may not know the end, but I know how to walk with honor right now. This intentional commitment to the present is the ultimate act of faith and the only true antidote to chronic, soul-crushing anxiety. Do not let the inevitable mistakes of your past, your own personal Ismails, the painful decisions made in fear, become an excuse for paralyzing self-condemnation. Look at my life. My failures were monumental, visible, and deeply regrettable. Yet the promise endured. Not because I was perfect, but because I finally learned to separate the failure from the future. Your past is an event, a source of hard-earned wisdom. It is not and must never be your fixed identity. Your mission now is one of resurrection, finding the dignity and the new potential that was buried under the shame of old mistakes. Embrace the process of redemption, recognizing that your scars are now your greatest tool for mentoring and guiding others who are just beginning their own desert walk. This vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the ultimate magnetic power of the mature soul. I ask you to consider a final, courageous act, an act of pure, quiet defiance against the noise of the world and the tyranny of the clock. Dare to be still. Dare to spend time in the quiet contemplation of your own journey, not to find reasons to condemn yourself, but to find the evidence of your own enduring strength. The voice, the inner clarity, the renewed purpose. It does not shout over the clamor of your busy life. It whispers in the space you create between the frantic demand and the intentional response. The meaning of your life is not a distant reward. It is a present reality, waiting for your attention in the small, sacred duties of the day. Stop pursuing the destination so fiercely and finally humbly allow the dignity of your long, difficult journey to define you. Your true purpose in this second act of life is not to complete the unfinishable tasks of your youth, but to transmit the resilience you earned. To show the next generation, through your quiet composure and grounded presence, that the long wait is not a void, but a forge. You are the mentor, the map, the living proof that a life defined by faith is not a life without doubt, but a life where the doubt is acknowledged, managed, and eventually transformed into unshakable, profound conviction. Step out of the shadow of your former anxious self and confidently assume the mantle of the seasoned, peaceful leader you have become through fire and failure. Before you go, I have one last intimate challenge for you who have shared this long, painful journey with me. Go to the mirror tonight, look into your own eyes, and speak one word of honest affirmation about the resilience you have shown, and then challenge someone in your life, a younger colleague, a child, a friend, to face their own anxiety by being the example of quiet fortitude they need to see. Be the mirror that reflects not the panic, but the profound possibility of enduring purpose.